In 1996, Looking Glass Studios began development on a project called Dark Camelot, a sword-fighting action RPG with an inverted Arthurian setting. What you're seeing now is a trailer of that game and its engine, which was first shown in 2013 because Dark Camelot wasn't ever finished. Instead, it mutated. Partway through the game's rocky development, the devs decided to switch the focus away from sword fighting and towards sneaking and thievery. The game was renamed to the Dark Project and then to Thief: The Dark Project, and upon its release in December 1998, the game received widespread acclaim and was a commercial hit. With additional funding secured, the studio started developing an expanded edition of the game which adds 3 new missions, tweaks some existing levels, and introduces new enemies. This expanded edition was released in November of 1999, and it was called Thief Gold. In 2009, Square Enix, who had acquired Thief's original publisher Eidos, announced that Thief 4 had begun development, and 4 years later, they clarified that the game would just be called Thief. The game was released in November of 2015, almost exactly 16 years after Thief Gold, and that's how we ended up with 2 games called Thief. First, there's some bookkeeping that we gotta get out of the way. Thief Gold is one of those extremely temperamental games that doesn't work on modern hardware out of the box. Luckily, there's a community patch called T-Fix that updates the game's engine, making it run on modern systems without issue. The updated engine also contains some other minor adjustments, but they really are negligible outside of like glitch hunting or speedrunning or something like that. Did you know that the copies of games that you get off of GOG are actually often modified to make them work on modern hardware without any extra work on your end? Well, the GOG copy of Thief Gold has T-Fix pre-applied. If it's good enough for GOG, it's good enough for me. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Join me as I play through both of these games called Thief. I'll highlight what makes each of them notable, and then determine which deserves to keep its name and which one is getting a new title. Let's find out which one comes out on top, as there can be only one Thief. Thief is a steampunk fantasy stealth game where you play as Garrett, an orphan trained to become the most exceptional sneak in the world by a mysterious group called the Keepers. After the tutorial, Garrett decides to leave the Keepers and use his talents for thievery. At the start of each level, you're given a list of objectives, typically boiling down to go steal some valuable stuff, and you're dropped outside of the place you'll be stealing from. It's up to you to find a way in, sneak around guards and servants, grab the loot, and get out. To help you on your way, you've got a grab bag of different tools at your disposal. Chief among them is the Blackjack, which can knock out unsuspecting targets for a quiet and instant non-lethal takedown. You also have a bow and a few different types of arrows, as well as a small selection of gadgets like flash bombs and mines. For most of the game, you'll be sneaking around, sticking to shadows, trying to stay out of sight. But if things go wrong, you can always pull out your sword. Remember, this game started as a sword fighting game and only became stealth focused during development. Okay, I know it looks pretty bad on video, but believe me when I say that this actually plays much worse. This is Hall of Fame levels of awful. All the more reason to stay out of sight and commit to stealth. And actually, it's not just the sword. Most of your tools are borderline useless. Explosives like the fire arrow and the mine will alert way too many people, making them hopelessly counterproductive if you're trying to sneak around. The noisemaker arrow is similarly unhelpful. Even though it can provide some short-term benefit by distracting guards, it'll also cause them to go into full alert as they investigate the sound, making them much harder to deal with in the long run. In some cases, the flash bomb can be alright because you can blackjack people while they're disoriented, but I've never really felt the need to do that. Far and away, the most useful arrow is the gas arrow, which allows you to remotely knock out enemies in a small area. The gas mine works much the same, but deploying the mine can be kind of noisy, and positioning it where you need it to be isn't super easy, so the gas arrow is a much more consistent tool. Alright, I suppose it's time to address the elephant in the room, the graphics. This game came out in 1998, and other than the character models, which look kind of awful, I'd say the game's visuals totally hold up. For these older games, I usually prefer texture filtering to be turned off, which would make the textures look pixelated instead of blurry, but these textures are high enough resolution that it's not too big a deal. As for the levels themselves, the geometry looks super blocky compared to modern games, but I actually strongly prefer this. For one thing, it means that the mechanics of the map perfectly match the visuals. Even in newer games, map collision is usually about as blocky as this game looks. They're just afraid to actually show you all those right angles. The result is a minor discrepancy between the way the game looks and the way the game behaves. Minor enough that it won't matter for the vast majority of the time, but you'll still find the occasional spot where collisions don't quite match what you'd expect visually. In Thief especially, that discrepancy is absolutely crucial to avoid at all costs because of your greatest foe, the floor. The floor is a vast and ever-present nemesis. Everywhere you go, the floor is right there with you. Sometimes the floor is merciful, other times the floor is brutal. See, Garrett has apparently decided that he's so good at sneaking around that he ought to wear tap shoes everywhere he goes to make things more fair. So as you're moving around, people will hear and react to your footsteps. You can reduce the volume by crouching and moving slowly, but you're ultimately beholden to the surface of the floor. So for example, you can basically run at full speed on carpet without a worry in the world, but even one step at a snail's pace on the ceramic tiles will make everyone within earshot try to hunt you down.
Over there! Stand forth and declare yourself!
And this is what I mean about the blocky level design. Like, look here, this area has carpet laid on top of ceramic tiles, and at one glance you can immediately tell where the complete safety of the carpet ends and the immediate peril of the tile begins. Unfortunately, the moss arrow, which is used to soften hard surfaces, making them silent to walk on, does suffer from ambiguous borders. It's also yet another tool that isn't that particularly useful, because the moss covers such a small area that you could probably just jump it if you really needed to, and on top of that, simply stutter stepping across tile floors keeps your footsteps from ever making any sound, which is a very effective alternative for crossing small distances. Rounding out the arrow types are water arrows, which can be used to darken certain areas by extinguishing open flames, and rope arrows, which allow you to deploy a climbable rope from wooden surfaces. Unfortunately, the water arrows aren't particularly helpful because your biggest enemy is the floor, not the light, and the rope arrows are less situationally useful and more occasionally necessary. The final tool at your disposal, which is probably second only to the blackjack, is Garrett's movement. This game features genuinely impressive first-person acrobatics. Not only can you leap a fairly significant distance, you can also grab and climb any ledge within reach. In this level, I think I'm supposed to find a lever to slot into this machine, which then extends a bridge over some lava, but how about instead I just jump the gap and climb up? No problem. At times, it seems Garrett's acrobatics are maybe even too good. When I performed this jump, I'm pretty sure I ended up skipping at least a third of the level, and this place is obviously not supposed to be accessible. And that bridge jump from earlier? Well, that jump only works one way, and I later learned that the only way back was actually added in Thief Gold. In the original game, skipping the bridge would screw you for when you needed to leave the level, but you wouldn't learn that for another 10 minutes or so. Another consequence of the blocky geometry is purely aesthetic, which I also like. I think it's kind of analogous to pixel art in a way. This is purely anecdotal, but I want to say that 10 years ago or so, pixel art was regarded as a specifically retro aesthetic, but I think that nowadays people are more inclined to accept it as just another art style. Not least because there's lots of pixel art out there that doesn't seem to be trying to evoke any nostalgia. In a similar way, I think this kind of level geometry looks really stylish, and it's a style that you don't really see anywhere but video games. I'd love for it to become as widespread and accepted as pixel art has. The actual layout of the levels is often confounding. Okay, this level takes place at a local lord's manor, but what's with this architecture? Why does this hallway just open to a garden without, like, a door? Why is there this random pool in the middle of the building open to the sky? And if I start on the street and go upstairs, I can then exit out onto the street again. I mean, that's not that weird, but it's definitely unexpected. This game keeps you on your toes. But at least I don't have to figure this all out on my own. The game does have a map. Take a look at this room and let's try to find it on our map. Oh wait, you can't. Sure, the map will highlight the area that you're in with blue, but it's so bare bones that it's almost worthless. And if I take 2 steps outside of this room, suddenly the map indicates that I'm down on the first floor, but I'm not. And believe it or not, this is actually one of the most useful maps in the game. For some of the other levels, the map doesn't even pretend to be helpful. The blocky geometry, bizarre architecture, and low-res tiled textures all work together to create a very weird, surreal effect. The end result is that even when I'm pretty sure I know what I'm looking at, I can never actually be certain. And then they really lean into that in one level when you're robbing an eccentric noble's mansion, complete with massive trees built into the architecture and rooms that are upside down or sideways. Generally speaking, the strange layouts of the game's levels make them all feel kind of maze-like. There are usually multiple different routes you can take through a level, but that also means that you might end up accidentally going backwards along routes that you didn't take instead of continuing further in. And the visual sameness of each level makes it hard to tell whether you've accidentally ended up walking in circles or you've actually made it to a new area. On top of that, you typically don't even know the specific location of the valuables that you're after, and the levels tend to be kind of huge. And remember, your map is totally useless. The end result is that the game requires you to spend a lot of time wandering around aimlessly in spaces that seem like they've been specifically contrived to be confusing, running the risk of detection with every door opened and corner turned. The disorientation really comes to head in one of the earlier levels added for Thief Gold called Thieves Guild. This map is massive, featuring a stretch of cobblestone street, a small restaurant which leads into a secret underground casino, a vast sewer network, and 2 different small manors. The sewer network is just one massive maze, with each room being virtually impossible to distinguish from the next, and the map provided by the game is just a trap that's almost guaranteed to mislead you. In order to actually get your prize, the game explicitly requires you to backtrack several times through the same sections of the sewer, and requires you to hunt down switches for gates. But not all of Thief's levels are stealth-focused. Several of them don't really include stealth at all. Instead, they have you wandering around, hopelessly confused as zombies, ghosts, spiders, and other beasts attack you. I can't say I'm a fan of these enemies. First of all, like I previously mentioned, the combat in this game is just horrible. On top of that, I just generally don't care about beasties as opponents. When I'm sneaking around guards, servants, and other people, I recognize them as, well, people. They have agendas, affiliations, maybe a family waiting at home that depends on them. People have a narrative relationship to the rest of the world in a way that, say, some spider doesn't. People are also just mechanically more interesting than the monsters. For example, the zombies get back up after you take them down. As a result, when the game throws a bunch of dinosaurs or zombies at me, I see them less as opponents and more as just obstacles. These may as well be sliding pillars instead of animated monsters. They're not really fun, and definitely do not improve my experience with the game. Honestly, I'm not really sure what to make of these exploration levels. What I really want from Thief is sneaking around big mansions, pilfering wealth from nobles, and evading guard patrols. Now don't get me wrong, I think that delving deep into a lost city full of living fireballs could be a concept worth exploring, but is it right for this game? I'm honestly not really sure. It's worth underscoring that this game demands a lot of you as a player. You're going to have to spot and remember details while you're wandering around before you even know they're significant, and you better believe that every scrap of paper you find lying around is worth reading. Most of the time they provide small but flavorful tidbits that help to build out the world, but often they contain information that is strictly necessary. Like in this level, which has a note that reveals that I need to flip 5 switches within 5 minutes and then say a prayer to access the talisman that I was there to get. By the time I found this note, I had already been wandering around and exploring the temple I was robbing, so I already figured where most of them were, and I had already picked up the scroll with the prayer in it, because again, you really do need to read every piece of paper you come across. But as you can see, this note doesn't just tell you where the switches are, it only gives you clues. So in order for it to be useful to you, you already need to know the whole level pretty well. And I don't want to spoil too much, but some of these clues are actually more vague than they might first seem. The point I'm making is that when you're playing this game, you kind of need to be able to keep the whole level in your head and very quickly get a feel for how different parts of the level connect. One later mission in particular really leans into this. After taking a magical artifact called the Eye from a haunted cathedral, you end up trapped and you require this ghost's help, but he wants favors for favors, and you have to come back here and talk to him again and again after each of the tasks he gives you. Don't remember how to get back to this spot? Tough. Remember what I said about spotting and remembering details? Okay, watch this and pay close attention. What catches your eye? Did you spot the well? Here, let me show you again. that well. This is the only spot in the entire level that you can see it from, and it turns out that it's actually super important, even though you have no way of knowing that you were meant to be looking out for a well yet.
I need to find a candle I used when I was still alive. The last time I remember using a candle is the night of my death. I was in the workyard, where the well is. My personal possessions were hidden, but I think the candle is back there still.
In fact, the game even gives you a red herring. There's a yard that you have to go through that also includes a small pond. And after the ghost gives you a task, what if you didn't understand him completely? Or what if you decide to save and quit and come back to this level later? Well, luckily the objective log updates. See? Aid the ghost. Helpful, right? In fairness, you can type notes to yourself on your map, another feature the game doesn't tell you about and one I only discovered by accident. But because the maps are so vague anyway, it's rare to be able to write a helpful note that actually relates to a specific place. But you also can't really use the map for more general notes because the maps often have several pages, each only covering a specific area of the level, meaning that you'll need to return to that area in order to see the notes that you've written on its page. Despite its extremely demanding structure, Thief does actually try to ease you into the game. For the first few levels, you don't even need to escape. The mission just ends and you're magically teleported out as soon as you complete your objectives. Or at least, that's how it is on normal difficulty. As far as I can tell, the mechanics remain the same across difficulties. The AI behaves the same, weapons deal the same amount of damage, enemies have the same amount of health, and so on. And while there are other minor adjustments like the number and positioning of enemies and loot, the main difference between the difficulties is actually just the objectives. The harder the difficulty, the more tasks you need to complete and the more loot you need to bag. This rewards replaying the game on higher difficulties as you become increasingly familiar with the mechanics and the specific level layouts. Another neat thing about this game is that, generally speaking, the levels are all quite different from each other. You can broadly cleave them into two groups, exploration and stealth, but even those groups have a lot of variety within them. It really feels like each level is taking one particular theme and diving deep into it, and it makes each one a very memorable and fairly unique experience. It also results in players in the community sharing their personal favorites and why they like or dislike each level, and while there are some definite trends, there's hardly a consensus. Tier lists get shared around a lot, and there are rarely duplicates. Here's mine, by the way. So what to make of Thief? Well, it's kind of a tough game to recommend. The game is extremely demanding and basically requires playing each individual mission in one session. I'd say I generally have a pretty good sense of direction, and this game still pushed me to my limits. So if you're someone who gets lost pretty easily, it might be almost unplayable. The thing is though, every single thing that I dislike about Thief is also something that I find strangely captivating. Even the game's inventory system is out to get you. Whenever you go up to a locked door, you have to scroll through your inventory until you get to your keys, and then you have to try each one individually. Yeah, it's kinda clumsy, but it's also kind of appropriate, right? It makes you feel like you're having to fumble through all the crap that you're carrying around in your pockets in order to find the right key, and if you know that there's a guard that patrols the area who might spot you if you're not quick enough, the whole thing just becomes super frantic. So yeah, the maps are useless, the levels strictly require wandering around aimlessly and keeping note of details before you know whether or not they're important, and the inventory is very clumsy. But while those all sound like criticisms, they kind of aren't. Because while I've played a whole lot of stealth games, I've never played one like Thief. Hell, I doubt even Thief will be able to recreate the experience on a subsequent playthrough, because now I'm at least slightly familiar with each of the levels. See, playing through this game for the first time doesn't make you feel like a master thief with years of training. No, the experience is way closer to a desperate convict trying to escape from prison. Thief is the video game equivalent of immersive wilderness training, tossing you headfirst into a confusing and dangerous world without any of the modern conveniences that would make it comfortable. Usually when people say that a game is difficult, what they really mean is that it's going to require a lot of tedious trial and error, or that the game outright trolls you by being so obtuse that it basically requires a walkthrough. But neither of those really apply to Thief. I only got stuck a couple times, and all I needed each time was a small hint, and they were things that I probably could have figured out before long. Thief is just generally a very taxing game to play, but that's also what makes it appealing. Not even in the sense that it's a more rewarding challenge to overcome, because I didn't really feel that way. It's more like it's so taxing because it requires complete engagement, and that's what makes it satisfying, if strenuous. Thief is a fantasy stealth game where you play as Master Thief Garrett. You'll be sneaking around, pilfering loot, and, well, that's kind of it, really. So it's pretty familiar territory from the original Thief. But this game makes several improvements over the original, a few of which come from the benefit of technology that just wasn't there in the 90s, like ragdolls. Piling bodies up in a corner in this game is a lot more fun now that they flop around like this. The original Thief just doesn't compare. There's also the lighting. The original game does its best with the torches that you can extinguish with water arrows, but the bottom line is that the lighting is largely baked in because real-time lighting just wasn't feasible at the time. So for example, if you close the door to a bright room, that light would still spill out into the dark hallway. That is not the case with the new Thief, and you can even hide in other people's shadows to keep yourself in the dark. Also, the AI has seen some notable improvements. The original game's AI is frequently pretty inept, sometimes failing to notice you even as they literally walk directly into you. But in the new game, they'll notice when you open doors or extinguish lights in front of them, and they'll go to investigate. Also, I'd say the graphics look pretty darn good. They're slightly stylized and they suit the atmosphere the game is going for. I think this game is a little too dark. I mean, the original Thief was called The Dark Project, but showed a lot more color than this one, but otherwise I'm a fan. I also like how important things stand out in the environment, like how interactables are highlighted in blue, or how loot occasionally shines to draw your attention. What I don't like is this nasty effect that covers your screen every time you're in shadow. I appreciate that they're giving a visual indicator for the light level, but isn't that what the light crystal in the bottom left is for? And couldn't they have gone with something a little more subtle, like a vignette or something? I mean, this looks awful and frequently obscures a lot of your view. Like, how often are you going to be sticking to the shadows in a stealth game? Almost the entire time? And when you do step into the light, naturally the game feels it's necessary to make the screen flash white, and sometimes that flash lingers for some reason. These screen effects are obviously and immediately horrible, and there's no way to disable them without editing a config file, which unfortunately I didn't learn about until after I finished playing, so you're just going to have to suffer with me. There are plenty of other graphical issues too. Every time you load into an area, you're subjected to extremely ugly detail pop-in, and every time that something with a cloth simulation comes into frame, the cloth jumps in place, which gets really obnoxious during some of these cutscenes. I honestly can't imagine how anybody could think that this looks better than no cloth sim at all, but maybe I'm in the minority there. I mean, static capes won't ever look as nice as a cloth sim, but they also aren't ever a recurring eyesore. I'd much rather visuals that always look consistently okay over visuals that usually look great but occasionally look horrendous and distracting. But this game decidedly takes that latter approach. Graphics aside, one of the other immediately apparent differences between this game and the original is Garrett himself. Look, you can see his arms. And he actually grabs the loot when you go to pick it up and interacts with the doors when you open or close them. That's kinda neat. And I touched on them earlier, but this game also serves up more cutscenes than the original did, and you get a pretty good look at Garrett. He's wearing a lot of belts. The biggest difference though is that he talks a lot more. In the original game, Garrett didn't really say much outside of the cutscenes that introduced each level, and when he did speak up, it was usually in reaction to something that, warrants a reaction.
Guess I'm not getting any information from Geary after all.
That is certainly not the case this time around. Garrett starts yapping right from the get-go and just does not shut up.
Too much light. Let's make it a little more cozy in here.
You'd think compulsively talking to yourself would be a pretty significant liability for someone who's trying to avoid being detected.
I'd wager that hound is more attentive than his masters.
Despite talking a lot, Garrett never really says anything of substance.
That was the easy part. This is a big house, and the Baron won't be taking appointments tonight. Not by choice.
Really, he doesn't have a personality at all, and he comes across as almost unbelievably bland. I'll sprinkle some of Garrett's musings throughout the rest of the video so you can get a taste of what I'm talking about.
Give me a locked door, I'll show you an open one.
Like, look at this additional objective from the original Thief. You can free a guy from prison because Garrett thinks his sister is hot and figures that springing him will make it easier to get into her pants. That's funny. And it's also pretty revealing, telling you exactly who Garrett is. Kinda sleazy and totally self-interested. The original game makes it pretty clear that Garrett doesn't really need the money, and that he steals primarily because he enjoys it and he's good at it. What about this Garrett? Well, it doesn't really seem like he needs the money either, but it also doesn't really seem like he's particularly enjoying himself. I'm not sure this Garrett expresses anything close to an emotion at all. So why does he do all this thieving? I honestly couldn't tell you. The closest we get to a motivation is...
It's not about the payment. It's who I am.
Which is literally the most interesting thing he says all game. Luckily, if you absolutely hate the sound of Garrett's voice, you can actually just completely disable it in the options. I'm kind of amazed this option even exists. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this before. Some people think that this partly has to do with the devs' decision to replace the voice actor. I didn't really notice that the voice actors were different between this game and the original because they both did a pretty good job. But people were blinded by the nostalgia and threw a big fit over it, so the audio director came out and said that it was because they were doing full motion capture, meaning that the voice actor would also have to be able to perform all the stunts. I'm not really sure I buy that excuse, because voice actors' performances are put on top of different motion capture performances all the time, and Garrett usually stays pretty still in all the cutscenes anyway, but here we are, and the game contains an option to disable the protagonist's voice. Now, in fairness, he does still talk during cutscenes, but there are times when he talks to other characters during a mission, and it just kind of skips his lines when his voice is disabled, making the conversations pretty goofy.
You do still steal, right? There's the Garrett I know.
There's more of a story to this game than the original. Well, I don't know if more is the right word. The original game didn't really have a lot going on narratively, with basically only like 2 story beats throughout the entire game, and really the first 5 of its missions have nothing to do with the final 10 narratively. The new Thief pretends to tell one big cohesive story, except that I think the writers don't really understand the concept of cause and effect, and not in like an avant-garde way that I could respect. It was really hard to keep track of why exactly Garrett was doing anything. Also, almost all of the dialogue is pointless, and it frequently borders on complete nonsense.
You haven't changed, have you?
What's that supposed to mean?
It means I don't kill without thought or good reason, and I don't get paid for it.
So basically it's okay when you do it, but not me. I see. I get it.
Where the original game built a dark and foreboding atmosphere, this game is just edgy and cliche.
We're not so different, you and I.
Towards the end of the game especially, the writing just falls apart completely. They're constantly trying to up the stakes, but it never makes any sense, so it just feels like they're making it up as they go along.
They may feel good now, but trust me, their bodies can't handle the primal.
No!
This one's mine. The Rat King!
Also, come on, the camera work in these cutscenes is just a mess. I guess it's supposed to be intense and dramatic, but it just comes across as sloppy as hell.
I never liked mirrors. I prefer to stay unseen.
As for the levels themselves, each level is designed as a series of small encounters with a pretty consistent density of guards, along with clearly defined areas to hide in and routes to take. Most of the difficulty that comes from navigating the levels comes from whether or not you notice the interactable that puts you on an easier route. But even the harder route usually isn't all that much harder. Take this location, where I managed to sneak past a bunch of guards normally, and then when I got to the other side of the street, I noticed that there was a way to climb up and cross the road in complete safety. Not that the route that I did take was really all that risky to begin with. In the original Thief, you're encouraged and frequently required to explore and find your own way through intricate, largely open spaces. In this Thief, you're asked to open either door A or door B, but both of them lead to the same room, and sometimes door B's key is hidden. You know the term corridor shooter, which refers to shooters where the levels are just a series of restrictive hallways, making your movement and positioning practically irrelevant? Well, Thief is a corridor sneaker. If you're now thinking, wait, a sneaking game where your position and movement don't matter? What's the point? Then, just wait.
Time to get off. I prefer being a moving target.
In between missions, you have to navigate several interconnected semi-open hubs, complete with shops and side quests. I think the concept here is actually pretty solid. The idea of picking up a bunch of marks from Basso and then going on a thieving spree across an open city sounds super fun, and actually isn't that far off from how some of the original Thief's levels feel, but the execution is kind of disastrous. First of all, the city is split into several districts, all of which are both very small and very linear. Like, fundamentally, this district is just 3 short roads meeting in the center, but then those roads have been twisted and coiled, which makes navigating them a lot more tedious, but not any more interesting. I'm pretty sure the tutorial from the original Thief is about as large as any individual hub area. As for the actual locations you end up stealing from, they're all sealed off from the hubs in their own individual levels, usually with only one way in or out. Yeah, these are called Basso jobs for a reason. This isn't a series of heists for a big night-long thief spree. This is a shopping list for items from a store where everything is easily found in its appropriate aisle. All this extra gameplay is just one huge chore, so I stopped doing them after the first round.
I've seen my share of prisons in the city. Nothing like this.
Remember how you can see Garrett's hands interacting with the world when you press E? Well, if you're going to play this game, I hope you really like that, because you're going to be doing nothing but watching those animations for a lot of the game's time. There are stretches of gameplay where you're doing literally nothing but mindlessly mashing E, waiting on animations while Garrett scoops up loot or searches through every drawer, because you can never know which ones contain valuables or not. Actually, that's a persistent problem this game has. It frequently grabs control away from you to give you a canned animation. Perhaps the perfect comparison is takedowns. In the original Thief, you perform a takedown by, surprise, hitting the enemies with your blackjack. In this game, you have to press a special takedown key to get a canned animation of Garrett hitting them with the blackjack, during which you have absolutely no control. Now that might seem like a small thing, but I think it has an enormous impact on the experience. Or take leaning. In the original game, you can lean left or right on a whim, but in the new game, you have to interact with edges in the map geometry to enter a leaning state. In other words, in the original, leaning is just something that Garrett can do, whereas in the new game, leaning is a property of certain places in the environment. See the difference? The same thing has happened to Garrett's climbing ability. Not only are you restricted to climbing pre-approved ledges, you literally can't even jump. Instead, you can only leap across gaps when the game permits you to. I actually see this as being fundamentally the same problem as the game's level design. This game is not interested in creating something for you to explore or discover or even interact with, really. It's not providing you with tools and telling you to use them, it's just throwing you into one fully canned experience.
Mannequins. I came here looking for a body, but not this kind.
This game often feels like it's playing itself. Press E when prompted, mash E and wait for animations, press Q when prompted and wait for animations. Climb along these linear pipes and stuff because it's the only way to progress. Hold V to look exactly where you're supposed to. Listen to Garrett spell everything out for you.
That box looks precarious.
Press F to activate your magical eye and find the hidden button that you need to press. Walk towards the objective marker, which you can see through walls. Sit through a long scripted sequence where you're just holding W and occasionally pressing space when prompted. And you better enjoy this long, unskippable animation whenever you want to shimmy along a narrow passageway, complete with a requirement to mash E halfway through, because the game is going to require you to do that over and over and over and over again. And remember, I didn't even do hardly any of the side quests, so who knows how much shimmying I missed out on. This game doesn't even reach the low bar of feeling like an immersive movie, so much as it feels like just a theme park ride, where the theme is edgy fantasy dorks try to act like they're badasses.
I don't know what you expect to find in there, but be careful. Don't become a ghost yourself.
Been a ghost all my life.
Except, of course, that in an actual theme park ride, you at least get the physical aspect of being jostled around or seeing something that's real in front of you. This just sucks.
Better tread carefully. The roof looks like it's ready to fall.
And about those shops that I mentioned earlier, well, it's not just Garrett who yaps incessantly.
Maybe I ought to get some nice curtains. Spruce up the place.
Black Hand Supplies at Lifter prices.
Even during the cutscenes.
I need to do a little research. It's
Need
about
to
Aaron.
stock up?
I'll be a penniless joke. The worst kind.
But more importantly, in the original Thief, you're given a free starting kit at the beginning of each level, as well as the opportunity to purchase additional tools. The thing is, the starting loadout and available purchases are all different per mission, and none of it carries over into the next mission. Neither your unused equipment, nor your unspent gold. As a result, the game is actively encouraging you to spend and use whatever you have, rather than hoard it. In this Thief, not only is all of your equipment persistent, there's also, surprise, RPG-style progression. Great. Oh, I need the razor to steal this painting? You mean the tool that literally wasn't even an option to buy yet? Awesome.
You walk a path few would wish.
That's the only one I know.
On the plus side, the entire progression system can actually be safely ignored. All of the focus upgrades are totally worthless, and none of the tools are actually necessary to complete the game. And the only one that I ever even used was the wrench, which only opened up more of those door bees. But really, that calls this whole system into question. Why even put this in the game if it serves literally no purpose?
There's a lot of angry people in this city tonight. The Baron's a popular man for all the wrong reasons.
But okay, the game is not all bad. Like, hey, I thought the level for Chapter 6 was pretty good. You're pilfering the Baron's manor while the city riots, and the rebels break in and mess the place up halfway through. It's probably the largest and most open level in the game, and was about as close as this game got to not being a series of corridors, while still ultimately being, for the most part, a series of corridors. Of course, that's Chapter 6 of 8, as in you have to suffer through 3/4 of the game before it offers its first and only decent level. Or how about the supernatural foes? The zombies and spiders and elementals of the original game are gone, which suits me just fine.
Do you believe in ghosts?
Huh? Spirits. You know, the dead coming back to haunt the living. Punish them.
This game features only one kind of monster, humans mutated by an enigmatic energy called primal. These monsters are blind, but extremely sensitive to sound and movement, and they're allergic to light, which means that you'll actually be trying to keep the area lit up rather than sticking to the shadows. This makes them an interesting change of pace from the humans, who basically only ever catch you if they see you in the light, and I enjoyed their inclusion immensely. They're probably my favorite part of the game, actually. I guess they just make for more interesting gameplay with this particular level design, as you'll be cautiously trying to creep around them in tight corridors and hoping against hope that they don't brush up against you as they pass you by. Unfortunately, they never show up alongside human foes, so you never have to balance the different methods of detection, and also they really only appear in 2 or 3 fairly brief sections of the game, though that might be a blessing in disguise. They certainly didn't overstay their welcome.
Troy's so-called remedy. I don't put much faith in bottled miracles.
There are also 2 boss fights in this game. The first is narratively a total anticlimax, and the gameplay of it also sucks, except that one of the ways to defeat the boss is to just ignore him completely and continue on with your day, which is exactly what I did. The final boss is, I guess, about as narratively satisfying as it could have been, given how much of a mess the narrative is at this point. The gameplay is a neat idea, actually, where she bursts into light that hurts you, so you have to duck and dive into shadow to avoid taking damage. But she eventually clones herself a bunch to create such a deluge of light bombs that it becomes almost impossible to avoid getting hit, so it doesn't exactly feel like a tightly designed encounter. The game's ending is sort of a non-event, not least because it's pretty unclear what the stakes actually are at this point, and then the game just kind of gives up and rolls credits. So what to make of Thief? This game feels like it's designed to appeal not so much to players, but more to shareholders. Look, it's an established, beloved IP, but it's thief in name only. Look, you have diverse tools, but they're all pointless. Look, RPG progression, but it's completely worthless. Look, parkour, but only along linear, predefined paths. Look, exciting, story-driven cinematics, but the narrative is nonsense and the camera work is nauseating. Look, a blooge! As a reboot, this game misses literally every single thing that the original game has going for it. These levels are very small and incredibly constricted. The story is just edgy gibberish.
Your city needs you, Garrett.
I'm no savior.
And the gameplay is mind-numbingly tedious. The few positives make up an incredibly small portion of the experience, like the monsters and the one decent level. And while the technological improvements to lighting and physics are definitely welcome, they're ultimately just polish on what is otherwise a complete turd. Well, there we have it. We've seen what the two Thiefs are offering. So, which one's better? Like I even have to tell you, the original game is Thief. So what should the new one be called? Well, back when the game was announced, it was called The Fourth. That's horrible. Or alternatively, Thief 4. But what does this game even have to do with the original Thief games? It's not just the voice actor that's different. The Keepers, Hammerites, and Pagans that are ubiquitous and central to the original games are nowhere to be found. The supernatural foes like ghosts and zombies don't exist. And the technology of the city has regressed, if anything. But you can also find this mechanical eye, which the game strongly implies is the same one that Garrett receives in Thief 2. So I guess that means that there was originally a master thief named Garrett with a colleague named Basso, and then after an indeterminately long period of time, during which some, but not all of technology was abandoned, and supernatural beasts stopped appearing, both for no apparent reason, there was a new master thief operating in the exact same city, also named Garrett, and also with a colleague named Basso again, even though the original Garrett and Basso have essentially been forgotten by history? Okay. Anyway, this game is just wearing Thief as a mask. Sure, the names are the same, and I guess both settings are fantasy, but if you scratch past just the very surface, it's obvious that the settings are very different types of fantasy, the gameplay is very different, the level design is very different, and the characters are very different. This is like Prey and Psycho Shock all over again. These games just aren't related. So I don't think this game should be called Thief at all. I'm tempted to call it Hallway Robbery, but that name has way more personality and charm than the game does. But, it's hard coming up with something as bland and dull as this game, so it'll just have to do. As for the first game, I would normally be a bit annoyed by the single word title, but the game was initially called Thief the Dark Project, and the re-release is called Thief Gold, so I'm willing to give it a pass. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time for Prey. Wait, didn't I already do that?